Nicole Cuffy is the author of Dances, longlisted for the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction and the Penn Hemingway Award for Debut Novel. Cuffy has an MFA from the New School and is a lecturer at the University of Maryland and Georgetown University. Her work can be found in the New England Review, the Masters Review, Volume 6, curated by Roxane Gay, and the Blue Mesa Review. Her chapbook, Atlas of the Body, won the Chautauqua Janus Prize, excuse my pronunciation, and was a finalist for the Black River Chapbook Competition. Her latest book is O Sinners. She lives in Washington, D.C. Karen Russell is the author of 6 books of fiction, including the New York Times bestseller Swamplandia and the short story collection Vampires in the Lemon Grove. She has received MacArthur and Guggenheim fellowships and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Born and raised in Miami, Florida, she now lives in Portland, Oregon with her son, husband, and daughter. The Antidote is her second novel. Jess Walter is the author of So Far Gone and 7 previous novels, including the bestsellers The Cold Millions and Beautiful Ruins, the National Book Award finalist The Zero, and Citizen Vents, winner of the Edgar Award for Best Novel. His short fiction, collected in The Angel of Rome and We Live in Water, has won the O. Henry Prize, the Pushcart Prize, and appeared 3 times in Best American Short Stories. He lives in his hometown of Spokane, Washington. Thank you all for coming today. It's just going to be a great discussion. I think that all of you have these terrific, ambitious, bold novels that are very much rooted in the American West. And I think that by grounding your novels in this palpably distinctive space, you establish yourself to ask larger questions about America today, and namely the conflict between individualism and community. And I think, I don't know, I wanted to start off by just asking you if you could talk about, and we could all take turns, your relationship to the American West and why this kind of place that is kind of figures in your novels to the same degree of presence that the characters themselves have. So I don't know which one of you would like to start, but please.
I guess as the Westerner, as a lifelong Westerner, I should go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a reporter in Spokane, Washington, my hometown, for 7 years, and I think I draw very much on that background, um, on asking where these sort of myths of the West intersect with politics, with culture, with all these different areas, and especially with this novel, with So Far Gone, I felt like rather than looking for some correlative to write about, I really wanted to just write about the world as it feels to me now, with militias in the hills and such a political divide really pulling people apart. And I feel like that's been truer in the West than other places. Maybe was the first place, certainly for me 30 years ago, covering the standoff at Ruby Ridge. I felt the beginning of this fissure that I feel like is now spread across the country, dividing families and friendships and neighbors. And so for me, it felt unavoidable. It felt like we were in such a time that to not write about this would be sort of um, to ignore the fact that it's such a big part of our lives right now, and that something I first noticed years ago is really something I think Americans are dealing with everywhere.
Yeah. Nicole, you live in Washington. What is your relationship to the West? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I'm kind of the opposite here, as I'm a
Mhm.
lifetime East Coaster. And I think that something that's really interesting that happens in sort of the narratives that Americans have about other parts of America is, as someone who is born and raised on the East Coast, specifically from New York, I'm originally from Brooklyn. There's this community is so heavily concentrated and kind of squished into one area on the East Coast. As a New Yorker, um, especially coming from like the city, with the 5 boroughs, and you have like their communities and cultures unto themselves. And so there is this sense of romanticization of what the American West even is. It feels so huge and expansive.
Mhm.
And it sort of brings up this question, I think, for people who come from communities like mine, like what does community look like in such an expansive space? But in the same time, I always kind of thought of California as an odd sort of sister state to New York, in that you have these really politically sort of concentrated areas, and then as you get outside of those cities and outside of those really urban areas, you start to see a shift in the politics and in the people as there's more space. And so I never actually went to the West Coast until I was an adult, and finally managed to get farther west than Louisiana. That was the farthest west I had gotten before that. And
Mhm.
was almost greeted with, almost a disillusionment. It sort of was a shattering of that romanticization that I think a lot of East Coasters experience before going to the western edge of America. And
Mhm.
I think that that disillusionment actually did me quite a service, because it allowed me to really sort of understand this country in a way that it's difficult to understand it when you come from these areas of intense demographic, political, ideological, ethnic, and cultural concentration, and then you get a little bit of it, because I was born in Brooklyn but mostly raised in upstate New York, so you get a little bit of that sense of expansion and shifting in the culture of a place in moving from the city to the upstate areas of New York. But to see
Mhm.
it happen on such a large scale out in California specifically was a completely different perspective for me that I am just really fascinated by.
Yeah, definitely. Karen, would you like to share?
Yeah, I will jump in, and I'm so happy to be on this panel. These are such fantastic books, and yeah, it's great to be with you too, Lauren. Thanks for moderating.
No,
I
thank you.
live in the Pacific Northwest now, but I grew up in South Florida, and so similar to Nicole, I think like I had this sort of fantasy that was presented to me first. Like you go to Frontierland, right, or you see lots of other theme park versions of this history that really invert the real aggression in a way that continues, obviously to this day. I wrote my first novel about a family of alligator wrestlers who have this kind of mom and pop theme park, in a fictional version of the Everglades. And that I would joke that this book was like Drylandia. It was like my rebound book. But
Yeah.
genuinely, it is. I mean, it is sort of the same story. I think those histories are really connected, And this fantasy of sort of Florida also, where it's like an American Eden. I mean, my grandparents came down and they bought, swampland sight unseen, and it's sort of this landscape that has a long history in this country. And then I think the myth of Terra Nullius is still alive and well in our textbooks and our popular conceptions and misrepresentations of the West. So engaging with some of that dissonance between the fantasy for sale and what is true, and really kind of the blood red cost of this so-called American dream that is still very much alive and well and on offer, right? Sort of kind of the people that we don't talk about, the failures, right? The cost to all of us, and to the land itself. I think this started to feel really interesting to me. And I think something all of our books share maybe is looking into the psychology, right? Like what props up a very obviously unjust status quo, right? Or what parts of yourself do you have to exile continuously from your own waking consciousness to participate in some of these systems?
Yeah, definitely. There's so many things I want to talk about with you guys. I think too, another thing that comes to mind is just a sense of regionalism in literature and the ways in which it can be very dismissed. That it's interesting you're talking about the American dream. We talk about it so much, and we're looking at, a kind of more talking about literature on a national basis, and now today too, in a global way, that in a sense going smaller and sticking to a regional area that is outside of the purview of kind of the dominant narrative of literature gets a little bit of short shift. But I don't know. I think that you guys all do in these. I'm not stumbling on my words. In these books, I think you all kind of take this grand scale look at the ways in which, when you dig into a region, you can see so much more about these different stratas of society. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think were there authors that kind of inspired you to talk about the West, and or were ones that sort of you're writing in opposition to in a way, or is that something that even occurred to you? I'm just curious a little bit about that.
It's funny for me, perhaps being steeped in literature of the West and so many writers, from Wallace Stegner to James Welch to Carolyn Kaiser. There's so many writers whose work that I feel like defined at a time when I think those differences were more severe. I'm just coming off of what feels like 8 months of book touring, and the thing I keep noticing is the real divide in America now is not so much regional, but urban and rural,
Hmm.
um, educated, college educated and non-college educated. A lot of these small towns that I go to, whether they're in, Florida when I was on book tour there, or in Iowa a couple days ago, or in Oregon or Idaho, the small towns have shrunk up around these places. There seems to be a lack of opportunity. The myth of American prosperity and egalitarianism has really dried up in those places. And so I think I have found that fascinating. And for me, it was, one of the writers that I've always loved is Charles Portis.
Hmm.
And I feel like Portis's vision of the West was ironic and but also saw through the veneer of maybe the myth in many ways. And so, yeah, I feel like a kind of reconsidering of what we even mean by that Western ethos, and what's replaced it in a lot of these small towns, certainly in the West, but I kind of feel like everywhere. I feel like that, there's a reckoning that we're all seeing politically in those places.
I think that some of it too, and thinking about what you're saying, is like this idea, I think in the past about the West was this idea of kind of this, it was this place where you could escape your past. And I think
Yeah.
now that we've kind of explored and kind of developed to the extent that we have, where else can you go? And so kind of you're stuck with where you are. And so I think that also like the lack of opportunity kind of creates that sense of, you know, closure, lack of possibility within things. Um, but we can get into that some more. But I don't know if Karen or you or Nicole would like to respond to that as well, or
I think for me, um, Karen, you mentioned the American dream, and I'm thinking about that and sort of filtering it through the lens of our conversation about region and the American West and um, my perspective, especially writing about specifically a Black cult leader who is sort of they're coming from an era in United States history that was um, particularly volatile as Black people were fighting really to be considered human beings in this country. And so when I think of the American dream, it's sort of a complicated term for me, because in many ways the American dream has never felt like it applied to me, didn't feel like that was my concept or my um, part of my American identity. Um, Even coming from, half of my family, my grandparents were immigrants here to the United States, and then the other half of my family have been here since slavery. And, I think that really sort of complicated legacy really muddies the water when we're talking about um, understanding America regionally, culturally, and politically. And so I know for me, in attempting to understand the West, what I was seeking was narratives. I wanted to know about what Blackness meant in these areas of America. And so I found myself reading a lot of slave narratives out of the Western half of the US, as well as looking into some of the history of, Black cowboys, Black law coalitions, um, all Black communities that formed and were later destroyed once they became prosperous. So I think that for me, I was looking for a story of the West that traditionally has not really been published through traditional means. And so my understanding sort of evolved over time beyond a sort of regional focus and more into this sort of specific cultural experience, like what is Blackness across America? And that was kind of the lens that I was mostly working through.
I completely understand what you're saying. And Nicole, your book does such a great job of looking at different moments of expansion and escape as well, right? You're talking about your novel encompasses a journey to Vietnam where young men are in war and becoming disillusioned with what they were told was a fight for freedom, and they never truly fully believed to begin with. And then with increasing, awareness, they realize the project that they're involved in and their own complicit participation in it. And then within the novel, you're talking about a charismatic leader, Odo, who, if I'm pronouncing it right or not, taking his operation of this like incredible religious cult. We could call it a cult, we could call it a religion, from kind of an East Coast base in New York, in Brooklyn, to then Texas, finding opposition there. And I think that what you do in your novel structurally, using the transcript of a documentary to talk about what happened there, was a really interesting interstitial space in that novel to consider kind of one part of movement and then why this greater leap out west, right? Because I think it's never a direct journey is also part of what I kind of felt like in all of these novels, right? And
Mhm.
so that's one part of it too. Yeah, no, there's so much more. I think that's trying to what I'm trying to say is like within regionalism, we have so much more happening, and I think that it's really easy for people to dismiss it. So I'm curious, kind of like people's backgrounds with previous authors and if they thought people were misunderstood or underappreciated for what they were trying to do to say about certain regions and what have you. But Karen, is there anything you'd like to contribute or
Yeah,
throw out?
I was thinking, no, it's super interesting. I was thinking a little bit about, how much I loved The Grapes of Wrath as a kid.
Mm,
When we were talking about hurricanes, so our family's home was destroyed by Hurricane Andrew, and I think that was such a real lesson in kind of everyone existing under the hammer of the same weather, and then in the aftermath of a disaster, all kinds of so much is revealed, right? Possibilities certainly, but also real lines. So that was, I didn't have language for that when I was a kid, but I was like, some people have the money to rebuild and come back. Whole communities, right, are now gone, and so there, that's sort of what it reveals, right, about, yeah, a community and the fragility and the resilience of community too.
and where you take that community. I know. Yeah.
That community. So I think, one of the things that as I was researching this book, which is the central conceit is there's this woman who sort of stores memories for people, just like a memory bank. And there's sort of a network of these people who sort of hold secrets for people. I think one thing that became really clear to me was the story I had gotten about the Dust Bowl, which is it's a regional anomaly, right? There's nothing global or international about it. In fact, there are dust bowls happening everywhere this new imperialism is underway, right? In Palestine, in Ceylon, there are dust bowls because the original people are being removed from their homelands and a cash crop agriculture, this global agriculture regime is getting set up. That wasn't how I understood it, nor did I ever think as causal as having like a causal role to play in this ecological disaster. Um, white supremacy. And it wasn't really part of the narrative I grew up with. I didn't think about colonial violence, right? Like that somehow I knew about both things, but they existed in these different boxes. You learn about um, the dispossession and ethnocide and attempted genocide of Native Americans in one unit, if you were me, if you're a kid in the 90s, and you learn about the Dust Bowl in a different unit, and there's
Connection
no way
between
to
the two.
connect those things. So I think that was something thinking about also just it's so private and individual. I mean, I really feel that in both Jess and Nicole's work too. It's like looking at like, well, this starts in our bodies, it starts in our families. And the way that silence has such a real role to play in kind of perpetuating the conditions that enable a lot of violence, right? That was interesting to me because I think that's something fiction can do really well. It's that invisible world that's you can't really tally it in statistics. Um, yeah, and I love John Steinbeck. That book was so important to me. But I think maybe this, without minimizing the suffering that he's documenting, it's wanting to have like widen the aperture a little bit and sort of ask, sort of like, how do we tell these stories,
No, definitely. And I think you all have characters in your books that kind of embody these contradictory forces that it's happening within them. And I think that their lived experience, for lack of a better word, and their ethics and morals and kind of their desires play out in different ways. And I mean, I think that, you all have people who are seekers in these books. I think that, for Jess, I think Bethany is a character for whom, and I'm sorry I didn't go through the effort of trying to explain everyone's novels. I'm expecting everyone to catch up with us. But Jess, I feel like Bethany in your novel is a young woman who has two children from two different partners. She's someone who's a college dropout. She finds it very challenging to kind of live kind of her parents' expectations. She's definitely someone for whom the like quote unquote American dream didn't happen. And I think she's found herself in a relationship with someone who is becoming something other than what she expected, for various reasons. And Nicole has, and forgive me, could you please pronounce the name of your main character who is the journalist? Farouk? How do you
Correct.
say? Farouk? Great, thank you. Um, I wanted to leave it to you to say, but he is someone who is Muslim and has left his faith. He grew up in Brooklyn. He has lost his father, his mother, someone who had passed away many years ago. And he's really at a crossroads in his life. And he leaves and goes to California in search of to do this major research project, as a journalist for a big story about this religious organization based in California right now. And Karen's book, I mean, is just such a fascinating look at this fictional land that dealing with the Dust Bowl and these desperate people who are in these situations where they all end up tied together in a sense because they are each kind of trying to find their way back home. They have a mother who, yes, is a repository of secrets and is known as a Prairie Witch, and who is always waiting to find her lost child that she had to give up for adoption. And, a young girl who's a basketball player who's trying to, find her footing in a world where her mother's been murdered and she's living with this bachelor uncle who's a farmer whose land miraculously seems to be unaffected by the Dust Bowl. So, just to provide a bit of background on everyone's books really briefly, but I think, I don't know, Jess, if you want to talk about kind of what you were hoping to achieve with these characters in terms of talking about people, and I think we all see it now more and more. And I think, again, that's where fiction kind of has this great strength and ability to kind of transcend a lot of flattening ideas and through lines about what's happening today. Um, could you please start maybe with Bethany, because I think she's a really interesting character to talk about
Yeah.
of like where
Beth,
religion and education and class meet.
yeah. Bethany is the daughter of the protagonist, whose name is Reese Kinnick, and he's a journalist who I think, another sort of myth is the Thoreau Walden myth, where you could just disappear, and live inside your own spirituality in your own head somewhere on a lake. And I think, I had that very real urge one day, when my phone chimed at me on one Sunday and informed me that I'd spent 6.5 hours every day that week, doom scrolling and sending $12 to every political candidate who promised that they could defend democracy. And I realized that I was living so much not in the world, but on this device, that I really had this image of watching it fly out a car window and tumble into the median. Once I created this character, Reese Kinnick, who does that very thing, who indulges in that fantasy, I wondered who he'd left behind, and I think a lot of families are experiencing, and a lot of friendships and a lot of neighbors are experiencing this break with people that they were once close to. And so I wanted to make it as close as possible. Thanksgiving 2016, Bethany's husband, caught up in conspiracies that involve the NFL and everything else, angers Reese for the last time, and he, I think the frustrations that he has, I share, which are that this loss of empiricism, the loss of rational facts, that we're somehow litigating, whether or not the world is round and whether or not climate change is real. And so rather than face up to that, he goes into the woods. And I think, you know, realizing that his relationship with Bethany, with his daughter, was at the center of this, was for me, when I realized I had a novel and not just, a short story or an idea. And then finding my way into Bethany's character and asking what it would be like to have a father who blamed you for the romantic choices you'd made. And to me, that was something that brought her character fully to life for me. And I wanted her, her own disappointment in the way her husband has turned out, the life that she and her kids has, is sort of magnified by the fact that her father, I think, blames her for the idiocy of the man that she's married.
And it's all too easy to just
Yeah,
blame it. Yeah, on
yeah,
the
and
environment.
that seemed both poignant and, in some sad way, probably representative of the way people are dealing with these things right now.
Right. I think that Farouk also is trying to break from the past and break from his family and try to find a way out. And in a way, this charismatic organization, religion that is, largely performing itself, we should say, on Instagram, which you do brilliantly in your way of kind of threading it through the novel and like allowing us to understand how this reach, exists and connects with others. I don't know. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Nicole?
Yeah, yeah. My running joke is that the my fake cult has a more active Instagram than I do. But
Good for them. That's healthy for you. Yeah.
right. Um, but yeah, no, we were talking a little bit earlier about the idea of escapism, and
Mhm.
I guess what Farouk and Odo are kind of both saying about escapism is kind of dark, actually, as I'm thinking about it. It's, both of them are sort of escaping, but their escapism is really just self-flagellation disguised. And so it doesn't really work for them. And, Farouk spends a lot of the novel literally running. And that running for him is an attempt at freedom, but we can see that it is also just self-flagellation. I mean, he hurts himself at one point and is like barely able to make it back to where he started from, and is still, just kind of impatient to get back to the running itself. And so again, I was just kind of interested in exploring like the idea of futility, like what happens when you live in a version of America that doesn't like you, that is hostile toward you. For Oda, our cult leader, he's a Black man who comes out of the 1960s Vietnam War / civil rights era. And, he goes and fights in the Vietnam War and sees everything that you see during a war, and then comes home and is treated the way that Black soldiers were treated upon returning from that war. And that kind of injustice, that kind of like impotence, uh, kind of psychologically mutilates him and creates the cult leader that later on becomes Odo, who is sort of exacting this sort of twisted revenge on his own followers because of that sense of injustice and that inability to escape escape the injustice rather, that is in existence in a country that is hostile to you. And Farouk, really same thing. We have a young Muslim man who comes of age during the 9/11 era, and as a result experiences a lot of discrimination and violence because of how he looks. And even though he is actually an atheist, it's doesn't even matter what his religious affiliation is in the version of America that he lives in. So he's experiencing the same sort of otherizing and ostracization that Odo experiences, that leads to a psychological mutilation in Odo, but then also does lead to a psychological mutilation in Farouk. It leads to that escapism that, again, doesn't work because it's not really an escape. It's a self-flagellation. It's hitting oneself in order to feel something other than what the pain of isolation and futility creates in him. So I guess, ultimately what we want from these characters is for them to discover what they need to discover in order to actually experience what freedom feels like, or actually experience what an escape feels like. And it doesn't come from retreating into the redwoods as Odo does with his cult. And it doesn't come from, going out to try to expose this cult, but then kind of getting seduced by it as Farouk does. It comes from something far healthier than either of those things that these characters will either discover or not discover.
I think both of those characters, I think, embody a lot of what's happening right now in this country, which is the sense that like only I can understand myself and only I am in this plight. And however, but at the same time, as much as they isolate themselves as individuals and kind of embrace this notion of like rugged individualism, for lack of a better word, they're also still in need of an audience. Farouk is a journalist who is like deeply embedded in that relationship, parasocial and otherwise. And I think that Odo as well clearly is someone who needs to be surrounded by a public, and that tension between trying to find community and being understood, hoping to find it either in religion or in politics or in trying to find a space to be in the West as well, I think so. But Karen, please, yeah, what would you
I
please
would
start
say, I mean,
sharing?
I genuinely feel, yeah, what would be appealing about a cult? Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel no
Mhm.
super, I'm like, I really get it deeply. Like, to have like an exoskeleton of dogma around you, to have a commute to, and I think the scariest thing is that, feeling that these longings are really human and they're the best of what we are, right? You want to live a life of purpose. You want to live a life of belonging and service. And like, you see the way that these can get co-opted and deformed. And one of the horror stories in this novel for me, the research that I did that I found kind of the most haunting was around, there's a Polish settlement that's based on a real place. And these are immigrants to America who are escaping a campaign of ethnic cleansing. And they're forbidden from practicing their religion, from speaking their language. It's a program of Germanization. It's like, we're going to erase you. You won't exist. And we'll take your lands and you won't exist. So they come here and they find themselves in this role of colonizer, right? And I was just returning to that time where you can't avoid knowing that. It's like you are living next to the reservation lands, which are right by what becomes the Federal Indian School at Genoa, which does just like tremendous violence under the awning of benevolence. So I found that really like a very American horror story, thinking about subsequent generations, how many of us fail to know. There's not a curiosity about that history. It's ongoing, right? But there's what happened to that, that this really roaring omission. I think that obviously still exists, and it's not a neutral silence. It's like a poltergeist. It's rearranging the furniture. It's causing all kinds of destruction still. But I think that for me, it's sort of thinking also about like these progressive era institutions, right? This Home for Unwed Mothers that you referenced, the federal Indian boarding schools that operated, I mean, into the 70s, right? We've never made any attempt as a country to atone for or even acknowledge that what was taken. And so, oh, sorry, I don't mean to, that's a
No,
really,
no, no, no.
but I think somehow I think thinking a little bit about um, exiting a cult, who can find the leverage to leave it, and
Right.
what keeps you in one, right? And to a certain extent, I think like the pain of reckoning with some of these things that are not collectively held, that just sort of sink into people's, right? Being a veteran, my dad was a Vietnam veteran. I think the disconnect between kind of the stories he grew up with and what he lived really destroyed him in a real way. So I just it's important to be speaking about this and looking for pathways to something like a more and I think fiction is a place where you can have these sort of reconsiderations, right? Or I love in Jess's book, like anytime I started to feel like a really easy antipathy for somebody, stupid Jess would force me to
Be empathetic to the other person.
so, and I think it's so important. It's so important. It's easy to feel a lonely superiority to a character in a book. It's harder to say, oh my God, actually, this person they're a devoted father,
Right.
right?
It's so easy, and I think that's where the manipulation lies, to try to know how to target people who you can pull into your organization. And those are the people for whom it's the most fraught. And so in a way, all of this economic disparity is a way of kind of leaning into, you're opening up yourself to all these other kind of fears and desires. And it's, yeah, there's so much you could talk about this. I think that's how you fall into a cult, is how you
But,
fall into, yeah.
but don't you feel like we're all looking for some cohesive explanation, and that's what that's what conspiracy thinking has in common with what we call cults, which often were then morph into religions. I mean, they're it that the continuum there is so fascinating, and I think both Nicole and Karen write about people um, excluded from the what we call the American dream. Who and that in itself is a kind of explanation. It's an explanation of expulsion in a way. And so yeah, I think that it's so universal that until we're confronted with what drove someone to choose what we think is a nonsensical explanation for the world. Until we're confronted with the life they're living, it's almost impossible to judge them. I mean, we judge them anyway, but it's unfair to judge
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. Jess's book takes place, in within the last 9 years, but
them.
I
Like the
think
last 2 hours, I think. Yeah.
yeah, in many ways. And Nicole's book is, largely in the present, but flashes back into the late 60s, early 70s. Karen, your choice to write, a historical novel, I think I really want to get back to this idea of technology and bring up this thread of where it exists in your book, which is that you have a character who is a photographer. And could you talk about what you were hoping to achieve with the way in which photography reveals something completely unbelievable and in your book?
Yeah, I'll do my best to be quick about it. I'm sorry, I feel like I too
No,
much
no.
coffee prior to the panel, but yeah, I really loved reading the correspondence of people like Gordon Parks and Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, some of these really amazing documentary photographers. And I bet a lot of people know already about, the FSA, the Farm Securities, the Resettlement Administration's project to send these documentary photographers out to introduce America to Americans. But there's always this tension also where, especially in the early days, it's to show the need for and the success of these rehabilitation programs. If you were to look at a map of where the aid flowed, again, you would see a sort of in some ways a map of white supremacy, right? It was not didn't reach people equally. And there's, correspondence where it's sort of saying, yeah, take photos of everyone, but really make sure you lay the stress on these white farmers because the Southern Democrats control the purse strings, and there's this real kind of documented racism. And it's interesting to think about who and what are excluded from these archives that come on, they substitute for collective memory. So again, that I think having a camera, this camera is able to take pictures of things that happened 100 years in the past and also hypothetical futures. I was writing this, leading up to the election, and I was thinking a lot about this story, what we're doing with our time here and how some of the most dire warnings, why don't they move us, especially around climate, right? And I'm like, well, because people don't know where to go. There's not a more plausible vision on offer. We're not giving people something that feels more plausible than this dystopia. And so then I think people double down, you resign yourself. If you have the means, you retreat right into your Decameron Garden, or you say this is as good as it gets. I find this really frightening, and that kind of cynicism feels like such an evasion of a real responsibility to try to imagine and create like the future we actually want to inhabit. And that's it sounds so earnest and invites an eye roll, I realize, but it's a really political question. I think that envisioning work is so important right now. So I think with this camera, I was just thinking about that too, sort of like the degree to which what we know about the past shapes what we think is possible in the future and how important it is to like use, I mean, that camera is just the imagination, right? It's like everybody got one.
Yeah.
We all have one. My kids are like so good at extrapolating, from a different value set to a better future. We can all do it, and I think it's sort of imperative to try because practically nobody is going to move in a real way unless they think there is a viable world where they have a place, right? Where they have like some creative role to play in nurturing a future where their children also have horizon light, and I think that was the story of the Dust Bowl for me in a real way, considering kind of what is bankrupt about what's on offer and like how that, yeah, that camera of the interior really like holding a vision of the world we want to see, how important that is.
Yeah, I think trying to figure out, yeah, what is the next American dream? And then in the wake of it, here we have these, what's on offer, and it's these charismatic religions. It's these,
Yeah.
organizations that kind of feed into and fuel kind of a sense of justification for any kind of dire feeling one has. And then looking at technology as an escape too, right? I think that's another place that it exists. But no, I mean, yeah, I think, gosh, I don't know, other things we should talk about. There's too many other different directions. I think, is there anything else that you guys want to talk about? Or Nicole, do you have a thought about kind of where this is going? Or, I mean, and you're looking exactly at religion. I think that like in your book precisely, it's kind of this, Eden that exists in California, right? I feel like Jess and Karen are looking at the West, like in a very stark term, we can talk about that as sort of this like really bleak landscape, whereas yours is this incredibly gorgeous, lush place where, there's organic food being grown, there's, people are building out set, scenery for the play and it's just a whole other world. And yet we know that it's not something that can be thrown down and tossed out at any moment.
Mhm. I think it's really interesting, the conversation around what the distinction is between a cult and a religion. There is a technical distinction, right? The technical distinction is that a cult is defined by having some sort of charismatic leader, and a religion doesn't have that. But I mean, what Jess said earlier about cults later turning into religions is basically true, that most religions started at what we would define as a cult. Most of the major world religions started as what we would define as a cult. So they kind of all start with a charismatic leader. They kind of all start as some sort of subculture or really some sort of political movement that later gets tied to a theology. And then that charismatic leader eventually dies, and then we can call it a religion. But I think what's interesting about that is that we're all kind of looking for the same thing, right? Like we all want like reassurance that our lives mean something, either while we're here or after we die. Like we want some sort of reassurance, whatever your theological positioning is, whether you believe in a higher power or not. We all want that. We want some sense of mattering, and so I think that there is this sort of perception around cults that, I would never fall for something that crazy. But, I kind of feel like we all have, or we all are, like we're probably all connected to something that's kind of culty. And the reason for that is because we all kind of feel disempowered. Like we live in a really big world, in a really big universe. A lot of things feel completely out of our control. And the fact of the matter is that wherever your faith lies, we don't know that our lives matter at all. They might not. And that's really, really scary for most of us to try to reckon with. And so trying to find something to anchor ourselves it can be this really sort of beautiful and fulfilling journey. But for a lot of us, it can be perilous as well. Like we can attach ourselves to things that are ultimately destructive. We can seek things that ultimately don't serve us. And so, in thinking about the landscape of where this cult is in California redwoods, we have all of this lushness, we have all of this sustainability, and yet underneath it, there's this undercurrent. We, as the audience, know something is going to go wrong. There's something sinister happening here. Farouk is running through these really beautiful scenes, like he's running through the redwoods, he reaches the beach, he sees the Pacific Ocean, it's all beautiful, but he's also being stalked by this wolf. And that is that sinister element. We know that something is going to go wrong here. And I think that sinister element is maybe not so much evil or malintentioned, but it is the reality that we all live with, that underneath our seeking is this vacuum of just not knowing. We don't know what we're here for, and we don't know that we matter. We hope we do, but we don't know how or whether our lives mean anything. And the average person does not go on to achieve immortality through their art or through their music or through their wealth or whatever it is. Most of us have perfectly average legacy. And I think that that's really, excuse me, scary for most of us, because I think ultimately what we want is we don't want to be forgotten. We don't want time to erase us entirely. We don't want to not exist. But I think what's fascinating to me about like the history of America specifically, and I can say that this is true of other countries and other regions as well, but as an American, I'm going to talk about America. The history of America has attempted to achieve immortality through the erasure of others. And I think that's really where America has gone horribly wrong. And we are continuing to reckon with that horrible mistake to this day. And because, as Karen said, there has never been any real atonement, there's never been real reparations or atonement made to the Native American community, there has never been any real atonement or reparations made to what was done to Black people in this country, we are going to continue the pattern of attempting to erase in order to establish ourselves as an immortal culture, an immortal American identity. And it's going to continue to lead to political violence and all sorts of horrible things. Now, I think that we can get this right eventually. But right now we're still not getting it.
Well, that's where, I mean, it's a great segue to say, like, that's, I think, where your books do a wonderful job of demonstrating of, at the end of the day, what is the choice you want to make, and then you've demonstrated all in your books the ways in which, that erasure and that work of erasure, in no way you're going to be successful at creating your own sense of sense of self and building it up in that way. And in many ways, the best that you can do is recognize that despite the loneliness you feel and the lack of recognition, you do have that in your community and you do find that in your home if you are willing to be vulnerable and forgive. And I think that that work of atonement is something that is, not performed. And that's why we continue to do this work of erasure, because that is what's being taught to all of us in so many ways. We need to wrap up shortly, but I think, Jess, were you going to say something? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I was just going to say that until Nicole talked about cults and religion giving people a reason to matter and maybe even to endure and last, that until that moment I hadn't realized that literature is my cult. So it's yeah, it's the unwieldy hope that every time you sit down to type, that what you say will matter and last and explain the world in the same way, that the biggest conspiracy theory does.
Definitely. Do we have any? This is the last chance. If anybody has any questions to put into the chat, please feel free to do so. We have a little bit of time left. But yeah, I don't know. Karen, is there anything you wanted to add on to what Nicole said or respond to?
I love what Nicole said. I think that's a really astute diagnosis of where we're at also. But it's interesting to your point about technology. It's also, I was thinking about just the ways that we're all networked too, and Instagram and like the conspiracy theories that really proliferate and capture people online, and how kind of disaggregated from our history, I think many of us feel. And I think that sends people right into these kind of spandrels, a DIY reality a little bit. And I think when, there's so many people who are so hungry, and that hunger is something to honor, right? Really for justice, right? Like I was thinking about anger actually in all of our books, where anger lives and what it does, and like Maisha Cherry's like the beautiful anger that names value and wants just a more just world. And then when it doesn't have the right outlet, or there isn't a pathway for it, what it can become. Anyway, yeah, this was I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Please, everyone, I encourage everyone listening to go out and get, if it's easy enough to click on the link and try and purchase these books, but you really all be well served by reading them. I can say that from my own experience. But I want to thank Nicole, Karen, and Jess for coming here today. This has been so terrific. I feel like we could keep talking, and we haven't even scratched the surface of so many different interesting characters. I mean, you all have such amazing worlds to dip into as readers by enjoying these novels. Please remember you can order books again through the link. Consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 20th year somehow of presenting free literary programming. And truly, go out next weekend if you are lucky enough to be in the New York City area and avail yourself of the incredible programming and marketplace that exists. It's just a true gift, and I think, as a free festival, you can't do better than finding it. So today kicks off 9 days of events, which include bookends events throughout the city. And Children's Day is on Saturday, and Festival Day will take place on the 21st on Sunday in downtown Brooklyn. And everyone is free to attend. It's an amazing time. I wish I could make it. I wish we were all meeting up and could go get coffee and keep talking. But I encourage everyone else out here to go get a friend and pick some panels to go to and meet up and make a day of it. So
yeah, pour one out for us, guys. Thanks for
yeah.
coming.
Yeah, I hope that it doesn't rain, and I hope that, bring your umbrella And you can always get 17 tote bags while you're out there and subscribe to all the journals you need. So thank you again. I really appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oh, my
Thank you,
pleasure.
Lauren. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Nice seeing you.
Bye.
Bye.